Chapter 2 of Malcolm Sage Detective by Herbert George Jenkins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 2 The Strange Case of Mr. Challoner. 1. "Please, sir, Miss Norman's fainted." William Johnson, known to his colleagues as the Innocent, stood at Malcolm Sage's door, with widened eyes and a general air that bespoke helplessness. Without a word, Malcolm Sage rose from his table as if accustomed all his life to the fainting of secretaries. William Johnson stood aside, with the air of one who has rung a fire alarm and now feels he is at liberty to enjoy the fire itself. Entering her room, Malcolm Sage found Gladys Norman lying in a heap beside her typewriter. Picking her up, he carried her into his own room, placed her in an armchair, fetched some brandy from a small cupboard, and, still watched by the wide-eyed William Johnson, proceeded to force a little between her teeth. Presently her lids flickered, and, a moment later, she opened her eyes. For a second there was in them a look of uncertainty, then suddenly they opened to their fullest extent, and became fixed upon the door beyond. Malcolm Sage glanced over his shoulder and saw framed in the doorway Sir James Walton. "Sit down, Chief," he said quietly, his gaze returning to the girl sitting limply in the large leather-covered armchair. "I shall be free in a moment." It was characteristic of him to attempt no explanation. To his mind the situation explained itself. As Miss Norman made an effort to rise, he placed a detaining hand upon her arm. "Send Mr. Thompson." With a motion of his hand, Malcolm Sage indicated to William Johnson that the dramatic possibilities of the situation were exhausted, at least as far as he was concerned. With reluctant steps the lad left the room, and, having told Thompson he was wanted, returned to his seat in the outer office, where it was his mission to sit in preliminary judgment upon callers. When Thompson entered, Malcolm Sage instructed him to move the leather-covered chair into Miss Norman's room, and, when she was rested, to take her home in the car. Thompson's face beamed. His devotion to Gladys Norman was notorious. The girl rose and raised to Malcolm Sage a pair of dark eyes from which tears were not far distant. "I'm so ashamed, Mr. Sage," she began, her lower lip trembling ominously. "I've never done such a thing before." "I've been working you too hard," he said, as he held back the door. "You must go home and rest." She shook her head and passed out, whilst Malcolm Sage returned to his seat at the table. "Working till 2 o'clock this morning," he remarked as he resumed his seat. "She won't have assistance. Strange creatures, women," he added musingly, "but beautifully loyal." Sir James had dropped into a chair on the opposite side of Malcolm Sage's table. Having selected a cigar from the box his late Chief of Staff pushed across to him, he cut off the end and proceeded to light it. "Good cigars, these," he remarked as he critically examined the lighted end. "They're your own brand, Chief," was the reply. Malcolm Sage always used the old name of Chief when addressing Sir James Walton. It seemed to constitute a link with the old days when they had worked together with a harmony that had bewildered those heads of departments who had regarded Malcolm Sage as something between a punishment and a misfortune. "Busy?" "Very." For some seconds they were silent. It was like old times to be seated one on each side of the table, and both seemed to realize the fact. "I've just motored up from Hurstchurch," began Sir James at length, having assured himself that his cigar was drawing as a good cigar should draw. "Been staying with an old friend of mine, Geoffrey Challoner." Malcolm Sage nodded. "He was shot last night. That's why I'm here." He paused, but Malcolm Sage made no comment. His whole attention was absorbed in an ivory paper knife which he was endeavouring to balance upon the handle of the silver inkstand. More than one client had been disconcerted by Malcolm Sage's restless hands, which they interpreted as a lack of interest in their affairs. "At 7:30 this morning," continued Sir James, "Peters, the butler, knocked at Challoner's door with his shaving water. As there was no reply, he entered and found, not only that Challoner was not there, but that the bed had not been slept in overnight." Malcolm lifted his hands from the paper knife. It balanced. "He thought Challoner had fallen asleep in the library," continued Sir James, "which he sometimes did. He is rather a night owl. Peters then went downstairs, but found the library door locked on the inside. As there was no response to his knocking, he went round to the French windows that opened from the library onto the lawn at the back of the house. The curtains were drawn, however, and he could see nothing." "Is it usual to draw the curtains?" inquired Malcolm Sage, regarding with satisfaction the paper knife as it gently swayed up and down upon the inkstand. "Yes, except in the summer, when the windows are generally kept open." Malcolm Sage nodded, and Sir James resumed his story. "Peters then went upstairs to young Dane's room. Dane is Challoner's nephew, who lives with him. While he dressed, he sent Peters to tell me. A few minutes later we all went down to the library and tried to attract Challoner's attention, but without result. I then suggested forcing an entry from the garden, which was done by breaking the glass of one of the French windows. We found Challoner seated at his table, dead, shot through the head. He had an automatic pistol in his hand." Sir James paused. His voice had become husky with emotion. Presently he resumed. "We telephoned for the police and a doctor, and I spent the time until they came in a thorough examination of the room. The French windows had been securely bolted top and bottom from within by means of a central handle. All the panes of glass were intact, with the exception of that we had broken. The door had been locked on the inside, and the key was in position. It was unlocked by Peters when he went into the hall to telephone. It has a strong mortise lock, and the key did not protrude through to the outer side, so that there was no chance of manipulating the lock from without. In the fireplace there was an electric stove, and from the shower of soot that fell when I raised the trap, it was clear that this had not been touched for some weeks at least. The doctor was the first to arrive. At my urgent request he refrained from touching the body. He said death had taken place from 7 to 10 hours previously as the result of the bullet wound in the temple. He had scarcely finished his examination when an inspector of police, who had motored over from Lewes, joined us. It took him very few minutes to decide that poor Challoner had shot himself. In this he was confirmed by the doctor. Still, I insisted that the body should not be removed. "Why did you do that, Chief?" inquired Malcolm Sage, who had discarded the paper knife and was now busy drawing geometrical figures with the thumbnail of his right hand upon the blotting pad before him. "Because I was not satisfied," was the reply. "There was absolutely no motive for suicide. Challoner was in good health and, if I know anything about men, determined to live as long as the gods give." Again Malcolm Sage nodded his head meditatively. "The jumping to hasty conclusions," he remarked, "has saved many a man his neck. Whom did you leave in charge?" he queried. "The inspector. I locked the door. Here's the key," he said, producing it from his jacket pocket. "I told him to allow no one into the room." "Why were you there?" Malcolm Sage suddenly looked up, flashing that keen, steely look through his gold-rimmed spectacles that many men had found so disconcerting. "Ordinary visit?" he queried. Sir James paused, apparently deliberating something in his own mind. He was well acquainted with Malcolm Sage's habit of asking apparently irrelevant questions. "There's been a little difficulty between Challoner and his nephew," he said slowly. "Some days back the boy announced his determination of marrying a girl he had met in London, a typist or secretary. Challoner was greatly upset and threatened to cut him out of his will if he persisted. There was a scene, several scenes in fact, and eventually I was sent for as Challoner's oldest friend." "To bring the nephew to reason," suggested Malcolm Sage. "To give advice, ostensibly, but in reality to talk things over," was the reply. "You advised?" When keenly interested, Malcolm Sage's questions were like pistol shots. "That Challoner should wait and see the girl." "Did he?" Malcolm Sage was intent upon outlining his hand with the point of the paper knife upon the blotting pad. Again Sir James hesitated, only for a fraction of a second, however. "Yes, but unfortunately with the object of endeavouring to buy her off. Yesterday afternoon Dane brought her over. Challoner saw her alone. She didn't stay more than a quarter of an hour. Then she and Dane left the house together, he to see her to the station. An hour later he returned. I was in the hall at the time. He was in a very excited state. He pushed past me, burst into the library, banging the door behind him. That evening at dinner Challoner told me there had been a very unpleasant scene. He had warned the boy that unless he apologized today, he would telephone to London for his lawyer and make a fresh will entirely disinheriting him. Soon after the interview, Dane went out of the house, and apparently did not return until late. As a matter of fact, after I had gone to bed. I was feeling tired and said good night to Challoner about 10:30 in the library. For some time Malcolm Sage gazed upon the outline he had completed, as if in it lay the solution of the mystery. "It's a pity you let the butler unlock the door," he remarked regretfully. Sir James looked across at his late Chief of Staff keenly. He detected something of reproach in his tone. "Did you happen to notice if the electric light was on when you entered the library?" "No," said Sir James, after a slight pause. "It was not." Malcolm Sage reached across to the private telephone and gave the 3 on the buzzer that always galvanized Miss Gladys Norman into instant vitality. "Miss Norman," said Sage as she entered, "can you lend me the small mirror I've seen you use occasionally?" "Yes, Mr. Sage," and she disappeared, returning a moment later with the mirror from her handbag. She was accustomed to Malcolm Sage's strange requests. "Feeling better?" he inquired as she turned to go. "I'm all right now," she smiled. "And please don't send me home, Mr. Sage," she added, and she went out before he had time to reply. A quarter of an hour later the two men entered Sir James's car, whilst Thompson and Dawkins, the official photographer to the bureau, followed in that driven by Tims. Malcolm Sage would cheerfully have sacrificed anybody and anything to serve his late chief. "And how am I to keep the shine off my nose without a looking glass, Johnny?" asked Miss Norman of William Johnson as she returned to resume her work. "He won't mind if it shines," said the youth seriously, and Miss Norman gave him a look which only his years prevented him from interpreting. 2. As the car drew up, the hall door of the Cedars was thrown open by the butler, a fair-haired, clean-shaven man of about 45, with grave, impassive face, and eyes that gave the impression of allowing little to escape them. As he descended the flight of stone steps to open the door of the car, a young man appeared behind him. A moment later Sir James was introducing him to Malcolm Sage as Mr. Richard Dane. Dark, with smoothly brushed hair and a toothbrush moustache, he might easily have been passed over in a crowd without a second glance. He was obviously and acutely nervous. His fingers moved jerkily, and there were twitchings at the corners of his mouth that he seemed unable to control. It was not a good-tempered mouth. He appeared unconscious of the presence of Malcolm Sage. His eyes were fixed upon the second car, which had just drawn up, and from which Thompson and Dawkins were removing the photographic paraphernalia. Peters conducted Sir James and Malcolm Sage to the dining room, where luncheon was laid. "Shall I serve luncheon, Sir James?" he inquired, ignoring Dane, who was clearly unequal to the strain of the duties of host. Sir James looked across at Malcolm Sage, who shook his head. "I'll see the library first," he said. "Sir James will show me. Fetch Dawkins," he said to Thompson, and he followed Sir James through the house out onto the lawn. As they entered the library by the French windows, a tall, sandy man rose from the armchair in which he was seated. He was Inspector Gorton of the Sussex County Constabulary. Malcolm Sage nodded a little absently. His eyes were keenly taking in every detail of the figure sprawling across the writing table. The head rested on the left cheek, and there was an ugly wound in the right temple from which blood had dripped and congealed upon the table. In the right hand was clutched a small automatic pistol. The arm was slightly curved, the weapon pointing to the left. Having concluded his examination of the wound, Malcolm Sage drew a silk handkerchief from his pocket, shook out its folds, and spread it carefully over the blood-stained head of Mr. Challoner. Sir James looked across at him, appreciation in his eyes. It was one of those little human touches of which he discovered so many in Malcolm Sage, and the heads of government departments in Whitehall so few. Malcolm Sage next proceeded to regard the body from every angle, even going down on his knees to see the position of the legs beneath the table. He then walked round the room and examined everything with minute attention, particularly the key of the door, which Sir James had replaced in its position on the inside. The keyhole on both sides of the door came in for careful scrutiny. He tried the door of a small safe at the far end of the room. It was locked. He then examined the fastenings of the French windows. Finally he returned to the table, where, dropping on one knee on the left-hand side of the body, he drew a penknife from his pocket and proceeded with great care and deliberation to slit up the outer seam of the trousers so that the pocket lay exposed. This in turn he cut open, taking care not to disturb the bunch of keys which, attached to a chain, lay on the thigh, a little to the left. The others watched him with wide-eyed interest, the inspector breathing heavily. Having assured himself that the keys would not slide off, Malcolm Sage rose and turned to Dawkins. "I want a plate from the right, the left, the front, and from behind and above. Also an exposure showing the position of the legs, and another of the keys." Dawkins inclined his head. He was a grey, bald-headed little man who had only one thought in life, his profession. He seldom spoke, and when he did, his lips seemed scarcely to part, the words slipping out as best they could. Happy in the knowledge that his beloved camera was once more to be one of the principal witnesses in the detection of a crime, Dawkins set himself to his task. "When Dawkins has finished," said Malcolm Sage, turning to the inspector, who had been watching the proceedings with ill-disguised impatience, "you can remove the body, but leave the pistol. Give Mr. Challoner's keys to Sir James. And now I think we might lunch," he said, turning to Sir James. Malcolm Sage's attitude towards the official police was generally determined by their attitude towards him. In the Department Z days he had been known at Scotland Yard as Sage and Onions. What the phrase lacked in wit was compensated for by the feeling with which it was frequently uttered. The police officers made no effort to dissemble the contempt they felt for a department in which they saw a direct rebuke to themselves. Later, however, their attitude changed, and Malcolm Sage was brought into close personal touch with many of the best-known officers of the Criminal Investigation Department. He had never been known to speak disparagingly or patronizingly of Scotland Yard. On the other hand, he had lost no opportunity of emphasizing the fact that it was the headquarters of the most efficient police force in the world. He did not always agree with its methods, which in many ways he regarded as out of date. As Malcolm Sage left the room, the inspector shrugged his shoulders. The whole thing was so obvious that, but for the presence of Sir James Walton, he would have refused to delay the removal of the body. The doctor had pronounced the wound self-inflicted, and even if he had not done so, the circumstantial evidence was conclusive. Luncheon was eaten in silence, a constrained and uncomfortable meal. Malcolm Sage ate as he always ate when his mind was occupied, with entire indifference as to what was on the plate, from which his eyes never lifted. Sir James made several ineffectual efforts to draw Dane into conversation, but at each remark the young man started violently, as if suddenly recalled to his surroundings. Finally Sir James desisted, and the meal concluded in abysmal silence. Malcolm Sage then announced that he would examine the various members of the household, and Dane and Peters left the room. One by one the servants entered, were interrogated, and departed. Even the gardener and his wife, who lived at the lodge by the main gates, were cross-questioned. Mrs. Trennett, the housekeeper, was incoherent in her voluble anxiety to give information. The maids were almost too frightened to speak, and from none was anything tangible extracted. No one had any reason for being near the library late at night. When Peter's turn came, he told his story with a clearness and economy of words that caused Malcolm Sage mentally to register him as a good witness. He was a superior kind of man, who had been in his present position only some 6 months, but during that time he had given every satisfaction, so much so that Mr. Challoner had remarked to Sir James that he believed he had found a treasure. According to Peter's account, at 11:15 on the previous evening he had gone to the library, as was his custom, to see if there were anything else that Mr. Challoner required before he locked up for the night. On being told there was nothing, he had accordingly seen to the fastenings of doors and windows and gone to bed. "What was Mr. Challoner doing when you entered the room?" inquired Malcolm Sage, intent upon the design he was drawing upon the surface of the salt. "He was sitting at the table where I found him this morning." "What was he actually doing?" "I think he was checking his bank book, sir." "Did you notice anything strange about his manner?" "No, sir." "When you found that his bed had not been slept in, were you surprised?" "Not greatly, sir," was the response. "Once before a similar thing happened, and I heard from the other servants that on several occasions Mr. Challoner had spent the night in the library, having fallen asleep there." "When you told Mr. Dane that his uncle had not slept in his room, and that the library door was locked on the inside, what did he say?" "He said, 'Good Lord, Peters, something must have happened.'" "Mr. Dane knew that on previous occasions his uncle had spent the night in his study?" enquired Malcolm Sage, smoothing out the design upon which he had been engaged, and beginning another. "I think so, sir," was the response. "The pistol was the one he used at target practice?" "Yes, sir." "Where did he keep it?" "In the third right-hand drawer of his table, sir." "He was a good shot, I think you said." Malcolm Sage turned to Sir James. "Magnificent," he said warmly. "I've often shot with him." "Do you know of any reason why Mr. Challoner should commit suicide?" Malcolm Sage inquired of Peters. "None whatever, sir. He always seemed very happy." "He had no domestic worries?" Peters hesitated for a moment. "He never mentioned any to me, sir." "You have in mind certain events that occurred during the last few days, I take it," said Malcolm Sage. "That was in my mind, sir," was the response. "You know of no way by which anyone could have got into the library and then out again, other than through the door or the window?" Malcolm Sage had relinquished the salt spoon and was now meditatively twirling a wine glass by its stem between his thumb and first finger. "There is no other way, sir." "Who has access to the library in the ordinary way? Tell me the names of everybody who is likely to go in at any time." "Outside Mr. Challoner and Mr. Dane, there is myself, Mrs. Trennett, the housekeeper, and Meston, the housemaid." "No one else?" "No one, sir, except, of course, the guests who might be staying in the house." "I shall want the fingerprints of all those you have named, including yours, Sir James." Malcolm Sage looked across at Sir James Walton. "I can then identify those of any stranger that I may find." Sir James nodded. "It would be quite easy for Mr. Challoner to let anyone in through the French windows?" enquired Malcolm Sage, turning once more to Peters. "Quite, sir." "What time did Mr. Dane return last evening?" "I think about 11:15, sir. He went straight to his room." "That will be all now. Tell Mr. Dane I should like to see him." Peters noiselessly withdrew. A few minutes later Dane entered the room. Malcolm Sage gave him a keen appraising look, then dropped his eyes. Dane was still acutely nervous. His fingers moved jerkily and the corner of his mouth twitched. "Will you tell me what took place yesterday between you and your uncle?" said Malcolm Sage. Dane looked about him nervously, as an animal might who has been trapped and seeks some means of escape. "We had a row," he began, then paused. "A terrible row," he added, as if to emphasize the nature of the quarrel. "So I understand," said Malcolm Sage. "I know what it was about. Just tell me what actually took place. In as few words as possible, please." "A week ago I told my uncle of my engagement, and he was very angry when he knew that my fiancée was "A secretary?" suggested Malcolm Sage, without looking up. "Yes. He ordered me to break off the engagement at once, no matter what it might cost." "He referred to his pocket rather than to your feelings, I take it," said Malcolm Sage. "Yes." There was a world of bitterness in the tone in which the word was uttered. "I refused. 4 days ago Sir James came and, I think, talked things over with my uncle, who said he would see Enid, that is, my fiancée. She came yesterday afternoon. My uncle insisted on seeing her alone. She stayed only a few minutes." His voice broke. He swallowed rapidly several times in succession, struggling to regain control of himself. "You walked back to the station with her," remarked Malcolm Sage, "and she told you what had taken place. Your uncle had offered to buy her off. You were furious. You said many wild and extravagant things. Then you came back and went immediately into the library. What took place there?" "I don't remember what I said. I think for the time I was insane. He had actually offered her money, notes. He'd draw them out of the bank on purpose." Again he stopped, as if the memory of the insult were too much for him. "And you said?" suggested Malcolm Sage, twirling the wine glass slowly between his thumb and finger. "I probably said what any other man would have said under similar circumstances." There was a quiet dignity about the way in which he uttered these words, although his fingers still continued to twitch. "Did he threaten you, or you him?" "I don't remember what I said, but my uncle told me that, unless I wrote to Enid today, giving her up, and apologized to him, he would telephone for his lawyer and make a fresh will, cutting me out of it entirely. I was to have until the next morning to decide, that is, today." Malcolm Sage still kept his eyes averted. He contended that to look fixedly into the eyes of anyone undergoing interrogation was calculated to confuse him and render the replies less helpful. "And what would your decision have been?" he asked. "I told him that if he gave me 10 years it would be the same." "That you would not do as he wished?" "Certainly not." "Until this episode you were on good terms with each other?" Malcolm Sage had got a dessert spoon and fork to balance on the blade of a knife. "Yes." "You know of no reason why your uncle should take his life?" "None whatever." "This episode in itself would not be sufficient to cause him to commit suicide?" "Certainly not. Sir James will tell you that he was a man of strong character." "Do you believe he shot himself?" Malcolm Sage seemed absorbed in the rise and fall of the balancing silver. "But for the locked door I should have said no." "What were you proposing to do in the light of your refusal to break the engagement?" "I had everything packed up ready. I meant to go away this morning." "By the way, where did your uncle bank?" inquired Malcolm Sage casually. "At the Southern Counties and Brown's Bank, Lewes," was the reply. "Thank you. That will do, I think, for the present. You had better run round to your doctor and get him to give you something to steady your nerves," said Malcolm Sage, with eyes that had lost their professional glint. "They're all on edge." Dane glanced at him in surprise, but there was only a cone of baldness visible. "Thank you," he said. "I think I will," and he turned and left the room. He still seemed dazed and incapable of realizing what was taking place. Malcolm Sage rose and, walking over to the door, removed the key, examined the wards intently, then replaced it and, opening the door, walked across to the library. End of chapter 2.